The running sore in global politics is the Arab-Israeli struggle. This is because of the irreconcilability of the Arabs and the global focus on petroleum, oil. The Jews, in taking over Israel, have the only country in the Middle East with no oil reserves. Go figure. None. Everyone else has oil, they don't. The Israelis are considered by the Arabs to be a latter-day Crusader state. And as such, the Arabs are not going to negotiate with them except for rare exceptions. When I say the irreconcilability of the Arabs, I mean it. On more than one occasion, the Israeli government has been willing to give land for peace. There was, as I taught those of you who had me in ancient history, the details of the Yom Kippur War of 1972. The only war where an Arab army actually seemed to be in the process of defeating Israel. That was Egypt's army. Well, after the Yom Kippur War is finally won by Israel with American help, America becomes enemy number one to the Arabs who want to destroy Israel, because the realization is that while the United States exists, we will not allow Israel to fall. The War on Terror really begins in 1973 after this. But an unexpected side effect is that Nasser's successor, President Anwar el-Sadat of Egypt, about this also, begins making peace with the Israelis. He goes to Jerusalem. He and Israeli Prime Minister, another former terrorist named Menachem Begin, meet with Jimmy Carter at Camp David in 1979 or 78 to sign what becomes known as the Camp David Accords, which is the only real peace treaty that the Arabs have ever made with Israel. In return for giving the Sinai back in stages, Egypt will remain at peace with Israel. It is the only peace treaty that any Arab has signed with the Israelis that they have kept in thought, word, and deed. The only threat to this was when the Muslim Brotherhood government of al-Sisi took over Egypt after the so-called Arab Spring in 2010-2011. But they were, thank goodness, overthrown by the Egyptian army. The Egyptian army has been willing to keep the peace with Israel. But with the exception of the... and Sadat was rewarded for establishing this policy by being assassinated by his own bodyguards. Hosni Mubarak, though, from 1980 until his overthrow in 2010, 11, 12, whenever the Arab Spring was, Mubarak actually keeps that peace and doesn't get killed. He doesn't expand it, but he keeps it. But nobody else in the Arab world is willing to sign a long-term peace with Israel, regardless of how much Israel is willing to give in terms of land. When the Israelis withdrew from the Palestinian territories at Gaza and on the West Bank, the Palestinians elected a Palestinian Authority dominated by the Palestine Liberation Organization terrorists. And these terrorists have not negotiated in good faith. They've taken all the money that the West and other countries have troweled into these Palestinian Authority territories, and instead of building sewer systems, roads, good water systems, they've kept their people in squalor, and they've invested in missiles and bombs to attack and kill Jews. The Palestinian Authority is not and has never negotiated in good faith with the Israelis. This is a running sore. So long as the Arabs insist on a policy of exterminating the Jews in Israel or driving them into the sea, so long as they continue to view this Israel thing as a Crusader state that, inshallah, by God's grace, at some point will be nipped out, with the exception of the Egyptian army, the Arabs will not negotiate in serious good faith in a way that will allow Israel to continue to exist. And after the Holocaust, the Israelis are not going anywhere. The idea that they have their own country and that will protect them from another Holocaust is a very real thing. One of the scary things is that the Iranians have had nuclear, well, they have been in the process of developing nuclear weapons for a long time. I'm pretty sure they have them. And a former Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was actually one of the terrorists who took over the American embassy, we talked about this last week in 1980 as one of the Iran hostage crisis terrorists, publicly talked about purging Israel with holy fire. And for a man who's trying to get atomic weapons, that's serious stuff. It is, for the moment, an irreconcilable problem. And it will continue to be a running sore until either Israel is wiped out or until the Arabs are willing to accept a small Jewish homeland amidst the dozens and dozens of Islamic Arab countries of the Middle East. We'll see. The Middle East is also enriched and important because of the world's focus on oil. Back in the 40s and 50s, it was thought that atomic power would replace that. But the fission power we use is essentially turning atomic power into a steam engine. That means you use radioactive rods to heat water. And that heated water becomes steam and turns turbines, creating electricity. The problem is that water is now irradiated and it is atomic waste. And what do you do with it? We have not yet found a good answer to what to do with atomic waste. Also, fission power plants are tetchy and they have problems. Just ask the people of Pripyat, a Ukrainian city near the Chernobyl, which means wormwood, nuclear power plant, which in 1984-85 went supercritical and poisoned a massive area around the Chernobyl power plant, which is still an irradiated hell. So, since we haven't developed fusion power yet, nuclear seems of limited use. And the most efficient energy source, short of nuclear, that we know of is coal power. I'm sorry, that is oil power. Oil is better than coal, it's easier to use, burns hotter. You can make gasoline out of it, aviation gas, all sorts of things like that, jet fuel. Most of the world's ready oil supplies that have been discovered are in the Middle East. Some are in Russia, some are in Venezuela, and some are in Nigeria, some are in Indonesia. But the majority of the world's oil is from the Middle East. Although fracking is changing this, and America being a global exporter of fracked oil is a very good thing for the American economy, and it also helps reduce the money that we send to governments sympathetic to Islamist terrorists. Because with oil money and with changes and the rise of fundamentalism, fundamentalism is a trans-religious idea. It exists in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and others. Fundamentalism has this as its tenet, whatever religion it's practiced. Life can be reduced to a rule book. Those who obey the rules are good. Those who don't obey the rules are bad. We want that old-time religion. We don't want modern society, modern values, modern relativism, or modern anything else. And anything that our rule books doesn't say is right is wrong. It is a narrow, intense ideology. Islamic fundamentalism produces a new thing called Islamofascism or Islamism. And Islamism is the fusion of a variant of fundamentalist Islam fused with totalitarian ideals of politics, like fascism or communism. And this Islamofascism has as its goal the Islamicization of the Middle East and the planet under their narrow interpretation of Islam. They are the ones behind the terror groups. They are behind Al-Qaeda, they were behind ISIS, they exist in the Sunni and Shia parts of Islam. They are the enemies of modernity and the self-declared enemies not only of Israel but of the West and of modern life in general. So the Ba'athist movement, Arab socialism, has been eclipsed by this new Islamo-fundamentalism or Islamism or Islamofascism. I will go ahead further and say this. In the Middle East, in the Arab and Islamic world, there have only been two societies that have thoroughgoingly modernized. The Iranian regime under the Shah of Iran in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s produced a modern middle class in Iran. And the idea of modern Persian Muslims angered the fundamentalists in the backcountry so much that there was a revolution that succeeded. It wasn't just anti-Shah, it was anti-modernity. And the Islamic Republic of Iran, since 1978, has gone out of its way to systematically strip Iranian society of any modernity, of any Western traits. The most successful modern Islamic society was Turkey, who in the 1920s, under Kemal Ataturk, the father of the Turks, secularizes Turkey and makes it a Western-style society. And from the 1920s until the late 1990s, Turkish women had rights, Turkish people had the vote, Turkey became a part of NATO. The Turks were as Western as, they were more Western and more modern than any Islamic society had ever been before. Turkey was the role model for a modernizing Middle East. But in the late 1990s, early 2000s, a new government takes under Recep Erdogan, the current dictator of Turkey. And his party is an Islamist party. Not only did they violate their NATO agreement in 2003 when we invaded Iraq by not supporting that invasion, but Erdogan's Turkey has systematically interfered in Iraq because they are terrified that the eastern fourth of their country, dominated by Kurds, an ethnic minority that had been oppressed by Turks, Iranians, and Iraqis for centuries, might rise up. The Kurds are like the Poland of the Middle East. And Erdogan was much more concerned with keeping the Kurds down than helping its NATO ally fight Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Erdogan's people denied the Armenian genocides of World War I. They are increasingly anti-American, and under Obama there was an opportunity to overthrow Erdogan that Obama did not support, because who would read to overthrow a foreign government? So Turkey is more and more a problem in the Middle East because instead of being modern, it's becoming anti-modern and Islamic fundamentalist. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is one of my heroes. She is a Somali refugee who grew up fundamentally as a fundamentalist Islamist. But her father arranged a marriage with a man she found odious. She escaped. But it wasn't before that they had performed female circumcision, which is a euphemism for an operation performed on young girls in Somalia, which is not an Islamic tradition, it's a Somali and African tradition that I'm not going to describe because it is too disgusting for class. But she was mutilated. She escaped first to the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, she made a movie called Tolerance that was symbolic about Islam. The Dutchman who made it with her was stabbed openly in the streets of the Netherlands by an Islamic terrorist. She came to the United States. She is now an atheist. It's not why she's a hero of mine. I think that's a tragedy. But for her, religion has always been pain. Her argument in the book Heretic is that Islam is at the same point that Christianity was around the time of Martin Luther. When Christianity was at that moment, there was no distinction between society and religion. It was all one and the same. And so when people began to have religious doubts, it ripped society apart and created 150 years of religious war. And that, and only that, produced the idea of a secular state with somewhat religious tolerance. Ayaan Hirsi Ali says, and I agree with her thesis, that many in the Islamic world are at this moment, and Islamic fundamentalism is a recoiling against the idea of decoupling society from religion to permit a secular, tolerant, religiously tolerant, scientifically advanced Islamic society from forming. But Ayaan Hirsi Ali argues that without such a change, the future of Islam is grim indeed. We'll continue next time.